On January 19, 2006, a spacecraft was launched from Earth which was to fly there for almost 10 years. His goal was peace, which for decades humanity saw only as a tiny dot of the world, Pluto. At that time, it was no longer considered the ninth planet of the solar system, but this did not make it less mysterious. On the contrary, the more astronomers learned about the outer part of the solar system, the more obvious it became how little we actually know about the world beyond Neptune's orbit. New Horizons was supposed to change that. But there was one feature that almost no one talked about then. The mission did not end with Pluto. The spacecraft was supposed to fly past it at high speed, transmit data to Earth, and continue moving further to an area where almost no other spacecraft had been before it.
And years after launch, New Horizons did something that the original mission couldn't even fully foresee. He discovered a new world. A world that did not exist in the plans of the apparatus at the moment of ego start. A world that was so far away that even the world needed hours to get from there to Earth. And that is why the story of New Horizons is not the story of a single flyby of Pluto. This is the story of a spacecraft that has already completed its main task, but continued to fly to where the solar system is becoming darker, colder, and unexplored. Now, 20 years after launch, New Horizons is still en route. In June 2026, the device came out of its longest period of hibernation in history. At that moment, it was approximately 9.5 billion kilometers from Earth and was preparing to transmit scientific data collected in the distant Kuiper Belt.
And this means that the story is not over yet. To understand just how incredible New Horizons' journey has been, you have to go back to where it all began, in early 2006. At that time, Pluto was the only large world in the solar system that a spacecraft had never directly explored. Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune have already been visited by spacecraft. Pluto remained the last big unknown. It was so far away that even the most powerful telescopes could not show its surface in detail. We knew the Eagle's orbit. They knew its dimensions. They knew that it had satellites. They knew that there was a rarefied atmosphere around him. But the real Pluto remained hidden. There were no mountains. There were no valleys. There were no ice plains. There was no detailed map of the surface. There was no answer to the main question, what is actually happening on this small world on the outskirts of the solar system? Therefore, on January 19, 2006, New Horizons left the Earth. It was launched using an Atlas V rocket and immediately gained tremendous speed. The device became the fastest spacecraft to leave the Earth and across the orbit of the Moon in just about 9 hours. But even this speed could not make the journey short. Pluto was billions of kilometers from the Sun. It was necessary to fly to it for almost 9.5 years. And New Horizons didn't just fly in a straight line. In February 2007, it passed by Jupiter and used its gravity to change its speed and trajectory. This maneuver made it possible to significantly reduce the flight time to Pluto. At the same time, Jupiter itself became the first major scientific opportunity for the apparatus. Its cameras and instruments were able to conduct observations of the giant planet and its satellites.
After that, years of waiting began. New Horizons continued to move away from the Sun. He traveled billions of kilometers. The land became more and more distant. The signal was getting weaker, and Pluto was slowly approaching. To preserve resources, the device spent a significant part of the journey in hibernation. Systems were turned off, activity was reduced, and then the device was periodically awakened to check the ego's condition and prepare for the next stage of the journey.
Governments, technologies, computers, and whole generations of devices changed on Earth at that time.
and New Horizons continued to fly. He did not see what was happening on Earth, didn't know how many people follow Ego's journey, couldn't stop, and could not return. The entire path of the Ego was calculated in advance, until 2015 finally arrived. Pluto was already quite close, but the problem was that New Horizons could not simply go into orbit around it. The device flew by. One chance, one brief moment. After almost 10 years of flight, the spacecraft had to pass through the Pluto system at a speed of about 14 kilometers per second, and then continue to move away. No second request, no repeat flight.
There is no way to open the device in a few days and look at what was left behind. The most important observation was to occur within a few hours. On July 14, 2015, New Horizons reached Pluto. And then something happened, for the sake of which this device flew for almost 9.5 years. Pluto stopped being a point. He became the world. The first images began to arrive on Earth, but the most impressive pictures took time. Because of the great distance between Earth and Pluto, it took about 4.5 hours for a radio signal to travel this way in one direction, and the transfer of a large amount of data took even more time. Therefore, humanity did not receive all of Pluto instantly. The world was revealed gradually. At first, individual images appeared. Then, new areas of the surface. Then details that could not be seen from Earth. And it became clear. Pluto is not at all like a lifeless ice sheet, as it could be imagined based on old observations. Mountains appeared on the surface of the Ego. Ice plains, valleys, craters, glaciers, complex geological structures, and a huge, bright area, which became one of the most recognizable objects of the entire mission, Pluto's heart. But this was only the beginning. Pluto was not just a small, cold object on the outskirts of the system. It turned out to be a geologically complex world. Its surface consists of various types of ice, and its rarefied atmosphere contains mainly nitrogen, as well as methane and carbon monoxide. The temperature on the surface is so low that the usual earthly ideas about the behavior of materials begin to work completely differently here.
Instead of a dead stone, New Horizons discovered an active and complex landscape. The area of Sputnik Planitia was particularly impressive, a huge ice plain connected with a characteristic heart shape. The photographs showed structures resembling giant cells. But the most surprising thing was that Pluto was located in such a distant and cold region of the solar system that its surface must have seemed almost frozen forever. And yet she demonstrated signs of processes that are still taking place today. The mountains of Pluto also turned out to be unexpected. Some of them reach several kilometers in height and consist mainly of water ice. At Pluto's temperatures, water ice can behave more like solid rock. That is why the surface of this distant world looked strange and surprisingly familiar at the same time. There were mountains here, there were plains, there were valleys.
There were traces of collisions, but all this existed in the world which revolves around the Sun at a distance of billions of kilometers. And next to Pluto was another huge object, Charon. Its size is unusually large compared to Pluto. Therefore, the Pluto-Charon system is often considered a special binary system and not just a planet with a large satellite. New Horizons also showed its surface. Charon turned out to be completely second, darker, more contrasting, with huge canyons in different areas of the surface. Together, Pluto and Charon looked like two completely different worlds connected by one system. But Pluto also had other satellites: Nix, Hydra, Styx, Kuiper. Before the New Horizons flyby, we couldn't see them this close. And gradually, it became clear that even this small system at the edge of the solar system is much more complicated than it seemed before.
However, this is where the story could end. The device fulfilled the main task. Pluto has been explored. The pictures are received. Data collected. Billions of kilometers have been traveled. If New Horizons had been a normal mission, that would have been the end of it. But the engineers initially left an opportunity for the next step. After Pluto, the device had to continue its journey through the Kuiper Belt. This is a huge region beyond the orbit of Neptune, filled with icy remnants of the formation of the solar system.
We know about the existence of many objects in this area, but almost all of them remain points of the world for us. The telescope can detect the object, determine the ego orbit, sometimes estimate the size or color. But seeing the surface of the ego is another matter entirely. This requires a spacecraft. And here there was a problem. New Horizons has already flown. It could not change direction like a normal car. An object located in a suitable region of space was required for a new flight. Therefore, the mission team began to look for a target. And in 2014, when New Horizons had almost reached Pluto, the Hubble Space Telescope discovered an object that could become the next destination. Its temporary designation was 2014 MU69. At that time, this was practically all that humanity could say about him. We didn't know what he looked like.
They did not know the exact form of the ego. They did not know what its surface was made of. And even his appearance was presented only in the form of a mathematical and light point. But his orbit was suitable. New Horizons could reach it. And then, something unusual happened. The spacecraft, created for the study of Pluto, received a second goal. Not a big planet, not a gigantic echo, not an object that has been known for decades, and a small, ancient world discovered just a few years before the meeting. And New Horizons continued to move. Pluto stayed behind, and ahead was an object that humanity had almost never seen. At that time, no one knew how strange he would turn out to be.
And no one could be sure that the first photo would really change our understanding of the early solar system. But a few years later, New Horizons again faced the unknown. The end of 2018 has come. The device was approaching 2014 MU69. The distance was getting shorter. At first, the object remained a tiny dot. Then the first hints of the eagle form appeared. And gradually, the same thing that happened to Pluto 4 years earlier began to happen. The unknown world began to turn into a real object. But this time, the scale was completely different. It was a small object. Its length is approximately 35 kilometers. It is located approximately 44.6 astronomical units from the Sun. And on January 1st, 2019, New Horizons passed by it at a distance of about 3,538 kilometers.
What appeared in the first images turned out to be completely unexpected. Two bodies, connected by a narrow area, a shape resembling a snowman. But it was not a snowman, and not an accidental collision of two fragments. It was an ancient object that preserved in its form the traces of processes that occurred at the dawn of the solar system. He was given the name Arrokoth. The word means heaven in the language associated with the Powhatan peoples and the Algonquian language tradition. The name was chosen with the consent of representatives of the Powhatan community. But appearance was only the first mystery. What was hidden behind this form turned out to be much more important. Arrokoth was practically not processed by powerful geological processes. He did not experience a history similar to the history of large planets. Didn't exist next to a giant heat source. Not subjected to constant changes. He spent billions of years in the cold outer part of the solar system, and therefore the surface of Ego has preserved information about the past, in the very distant past, about the time when the sun and the planets were just forming. Arrokoth's research showed that its two lobes have similar characteristics and probably formed in one local region of the solar nebula, after which they slowly merged. This supports the scenario of a relatively mild formation, rather than a catastrophic collision of two completely different bodies.
It was here that New Horizons gave humanity something more than just beautiful photos. He allowed us to look into an era that is older than the Earth, when our planet did not yet exist in its current form, when there were no continents, there were no oceans, there was no life, there was no Earth itself as we know it. There was only material from which the solar system later arose: ice, dust, organic compounds, small particles, and a huge cloud of matter revolving around the young sun. Part of this material became planets. Part of it is satellites. Part was thrown to the outskirts of the system.
Arrokoth can be one of those rare objects that have preserved this ancient era almost in its original form. Its surface has a pronounced reddish tint. Studies show the presence of methanol, water ice, and organic substances. At the same time, the surface remains relatively smooth to a large extent, and large signs of destructive collisions are limited. It turned out something amazing. New Horizons began its journey around Pluto. But the second world turned out to be even more ancient in some sense. Pluto is a complex object that has undergone a huge number of processes. Arrokoth is like a preserved fragment of the very beginning. And all this was detected by the same device. But after Arrokoth, an even more interesting question arose. What now? Where is New Horizons going? What can he see? And how much time does he have left?
Because the spacecraft did not stop near Arrokoth, it continued to move away from the sun, and now it's farther than a person or any other device that has ever explored the Kuiper Belt directly. But there is no next big object ahead, which is already guaranteed to be waiting for the Ego. No Pluto, no Arrokoth. There is no pre-prepared main goal. There is only a huge space, Kuiper Belt, billions of kilometers of almost empty darkness, and many small worlds that we don't even see well enough yet to call them real destinations. That is why the next stage of New Horizons may turn out to be the most unusual, because now the device doesn't just fly to the world known in advance. He moves into the area where obscurity itself becomes the goal. In June 2026, NASA reported that New Horizons had completed its longest hibernation, 321 days, and was operational again. The apparatus has begun preparations for the transfer of scientific data collected in the distant Kuiper Belt.
And this means that 20 years after its launch, New Horizons is still working, still transmitting data, still exploring the outer solar system, and it is still moving away from the Earth. Every second, the distance is getting bigger. The sun occupies less and less space in its sky. The sunlight becomes weaker. The planets are far behind, and ahead begins the space that mankind has only partially explored. And here arises one of the strangest features of this mission. New Horizons was created in the era when Pluto was considered the 9th planet. It started on January 19, 2006. A few months later, Pluto officially received a second classification. The device continued its flight. 9 years later, he arrived at Pluto, showed the surface of the Ego. Charon showed. He showed the satellites.
Then flew further. 3 years after Pluto, he reached Arrokoth. And again, he showed humanity a piece that no one had ever seen up close before. Now, he flies even further. And perhaps the most beautiful part of this story is that New Horizons was never a return vehicle. It was created for one direction. There, outer solar system. Next, and so on, and so on. He will never again see the Earth close up. It will never return to the Sun. It will never pass by Pluto again. All the images he will ever make will come from this single outward journey. And that's why every new observation of New Horizons has a special meaning. This is not just another photograph of a distant object.
This is an image obtained by a device that is located in a place where humanity has almost never been. Someday his energy will run out. Someday the connection will become too weak. Someday scientific instruments will stop working. But even after this, the device will continue to run. Without an engine that must constantly push the ego forward. Without a crew. No possibility to change the decision. It will simply move along a trajectory through the outer part of the solar system. And then, further, beyond the areas most familiar to us. And this brings us back to Pluto. Because when New Horizons launched, Pluto was the main target, the farthest point of human exploration of the planetary part of the solar system. It seemed that this is where the map ends. This is an image obtained by a device that is located in a place where humanity has almost never been. Someday his energy will run out. Someday the connection will become too weak. Someday scientific instruments will stop working. But even after this, the device will continue to run. Without an engine that must constantly push the ego forward. Without a crew. No possibility to change the decision. It will simply move along a trajectory through the outer part of the solar system. And then, further, beyond the areas most familiar to us. And this brings us back to Pluto. Because when New Horizons launched, Pluto was the main target, the farthest point of human exploration of the planetary part of the solar system. It seemed that this is where the map ends.
But when the apparatus arrived there, it turned out that Pluto is not the end. Behind it was the Kuiper Belt. Behind it are even more distant objects. And behind them are the boundaries of the region in which the solar wind is still able to influence the surrounding space. And the further New Horizons flies, the clearer one simple truth becomes. The solar system is much larger than it appears in textbook images. We are used to seeing the Sun, 8 planets, and several large satellites. But this is only a small part. Behind Neptune begins a vast area of ancient ice and stone. And New Horizons became the first device that began to study it not through a telescope, but directly from the inside. He has already proved that one unknown world can completely change our understanding of the outer solar system. Pluto proved that a small ice world can be geologically complex. Arrokoth showed that almost pristine remnants of the era of its birth can be preserved on the outskirts of the solar system.
And the next object, which will one day be in the field of view of New Horizons, may tell another story. We do not yet know which one it is. And this is the main difference between this mission and most space travel. When New Horizons approaches an unknown object, we don't always know what we'll see, because the outer edge of the solar system has not yet been mapped. There remain worlds that humanity discovered only as points of the world. Some of them are too small. Some are too dark. Some are too far away. And some are not yet open at all. New Horizons has already encountered such a world once. At first, it was called 2014 MU69. Then he became Arrokoth. And until the very approach, no one could know exactly what form it has. A few years later, photographs of this object became one of the most distant direct images of the second world ever received by mankind.
And this did not happen because Arrokoth was huge, not because he was bright, and because the little device continued to fly. And that is why New Horizons cannot be perceived only as a machine that once photographed Pluto. This is a cosmic witness. He started from a world where Pluto was the 9th planet, flew past Jupiter,
spent almost a decade in prison, reached Pluto. He revealed the true surface of his ego, continued movement, found Arrokoth, looked into the past of the solar system, and now he continues to go into the dark. Every year, the ego signal becomes weaker. Every year, the distance increases. Every year, the amount of energy available for scientific operations decreases. But while the device responds, the story continues. And somewhere far from the Earth, almost 9.5 billion kilometers away, a small human device is collecting data again. He is in a place where no man has ever been, where the sun no longer looks so huge and bright, where there is almost no light around, where there can be huge distances between separate objects, and there where any new picture can show the world, which before that existed for us only in the form of a weak spot on the image of the telescope. New Horizons may never again receive a target as famous as Pluto. Arrokoth will probably remain the most distant object he has ever directly explored. And perhaps there is still an opening ahead about which we do not even suspect today. We don't know that. But this is exactly what makes the continuation of the mission so unusual. Because New Horizons has already done the impossible. He turned Pluto from a distant point into a real world. He transformed Arrokoth from an unknown designation into an ancient object with his own history. And now he continues moving to where the map ends. Not to the edge of the universe, not even to the edge of the solar system, and simply further than we have ever sent a similar device. And perhaps the day will come when the last New Horizons science data package is beamed back to Earth. The last set of measurements, the last pictures, the latest information from the outer part of the solar system. After that, the Earth will no longer hear anything from him. But the device itself will continue to fly, silent, cold, almost invisible, created by humans on a small planet near one ordinary star,
and directed into the darkness, not because there was necessarily something known there, and because humanity wanted to know what lies ahead. And that's why the final New Horizons images, whatever they turn out to be, will not mark the end of the ego's journey. They will be the last message from the apparatus, which has been moving in one direction all its life. From the sun, for Pluto, for Arrokoth, and further, to that part of the solar system that humanity is just beginning to see. And then there will be silence, and New Horizons will continue its journey, already without us.